Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
Welcome back, everybody. So we're in part 2 today, and so now we kind of did the overview of mimetic desire, mimetic crisis, and the scapegoat. We went through some pretty prominent examples in more recent literature, fiction, pop culture, and talking about how it even has become in a very recent example where somebody's actually like using that language of mimesis in the actual script of the show. But now we're going to kind of actually go backwards. We're going to rewind a little bit and go all the way to some of the ancient and biblical sources to this concept. So we're going to get into first the Old Testament, really, because that kind of sets the stage in large part. But then how is this idea of mimetic desire and the scapegoat, in one sense you could say it's fulfilled, but from Girard's point of view, you can almost say it's also kind of broken. Like the fulfillment comes in the breaking of that cycle. And so that's what today is going to be.
Yeah, so when we were last leaving off, we were just about to get into some of this, line of thought that I've been developing and seeking to understand and kind of taken from a number of different sources, really across the spectrum, from both kind of modern psychology and anthropology, and, the church tradition and things like that, and trying to identify where the overlap is and make a cohesive worldview instead of this compartmental.
And you were talking about sacrifice.
And that's going to, it's all coming together. I think specifically what I was getting at was this idea of we are mimetic creatures insofar as we are imitators, which is to say we only develop in community. We only develop when there's an other outside of us that we basically rebound off of, and they rebound off of us because it's a two-way street kind of thing. So beyond simply the sacrifice, which I know we're going to get into a lot of, there's this larger concept that this speaks to, in which we belong to communities, and that our default as creatures is not the hyper-individualism that we've been raised into, that's very much just like we soak that hyper individualism in without even realizing. And I see this in my own children. I have teenagers now, and I've seen how the culture, they just soak it up, right? They don't have to be taught it. But it's this idea that you're an autonomous individual, which is just not true at any layer of your being. And when it comes to
the natural, whether we're talking pre-fallen or post-fallen humanity, it is unnatural.
Yeah, it's not right that he should be alone. And Eve is created. The Trinity is a community. There's no reality in which the kind of autonomized hyper individuality, because I think that you can have individuality, a healthy sense of individuality that does exist, but even your individuality is technically a community of elements that come together to form you. We have a relationship with the world around us, and we are involved in the kind of spiritual reality that engages with our relationship with each other, right? Some people might suggest that it emerges from our relationship with each other, like society, for example, like the zeitgeist, right? The spirit of the age, the spirit of the world, or, the vibe of a place like New York City, or the vibe of a place like Kansas City or something like that. Or if you go down south and you experience Southern culture, all these different cultures that we experience, these are kind of, frankly, spiritual manifestations. And some people would say that they're emergent. I'm not sure that's the appropriate Christian take. I think that it's better to understand that they are there's a spirit, they are spirits, be they angels or demons, that engage with our communities and kind of play in the reality that forms between us, so to speak. This is something that I'm developing. So if I'm, as we continue to podcast, I think I'm going to keep bringing it up. But this plays into it, this whole meme thing or mimetic
Well,
thing.
no, absolutely. And that's honestly like every other person that I've talked to about this, because I've got a priest friend who he actually approached me and he's like, hey, have you heard of this? And then we started talking about it. And yeah, it was a more modern, and I keep saying modern as if Rene Girard was around 500 years ago. He only died like 20 years ago or 15, 20 years ago.
Right.
So he's obviously very recent too. But we're starting to see, as you were kind of talking about when you were describing your kids' experience, how we have this indoctrination of atomization of individuality, but then there's this grappling with the kind of communal reality behind our nature as well. And it is coming out in this mimetic desire, mimetic crisis, and scapegoat. And yeah, there's a lot of, and we didn't even talk about, but like you were mentioning, and we kind of joked about like cancellation and that sort of stuff online. Like that is the most recent manifestation of scapegoating is the cancellation. And so you see the same sort of sacrifice sort of thing taking place, but now it's not on the stone altar with a knife. It's on the, information altar, so to speak.
Yeah, the digital altar type thing. For better or for worse, there's bad people out there that deserve their comeuppance as far as it goes, right? And then there's people out there that frankly don't seem to. But everyone gets caught up in the wash when you get into this reality.
And the pulling back the veil on this, what Girard and the more recent interpreters of this would say is that it's really not about the reason behind it. So like you were saying, yeah, in some sense it could be motivated by justice, like somebody needs, their comeuppance, but it's not even like the action itself isn't about the reason behind it. And that's the same thing when we talk about the ancient examples of the scapegoat, is that they actually were innocent. And yet they were still the sacrificial model. And it kind of goes into, you brought up the short story of the lottery where it was completely random. And so of course the person was innocent, and yet it still quote unquote worked for the community. And that's the whole idea. And actually the idea of the innocent scapegoat, this kind of ties in perfectly to our conversation on where is this showing up in the Bible, especially the Old Testament. And how does it start to form the communities, not just around the action, but then the communities form around the stories associated with the individual. And there again, that goes right back into what Girard was finding, is that you have this action taking place and the people start to ritualize it and they start to mythologize it, and their stories are built around this thing taking place. So from the pagan example, he actually uses the story of Oedipus, the tragedy of Oedipus, as an ancient example. Also, you have, especially with like mimetic desire and scapegoating, you have the founding of Rome and Romulus and Remus as another kind of like, and we jokingly brought up how we see it in our young kids, the mimetic desire and the crisis, but there again, it has its roots in the mythological founding of Rome. And you have these brothers, and oh my gosh, brothers fighting about something and then leading to violence and a city being built.
Gosh, vaguely familiar.
If only there was some sort of Christian parallel that one could,
I mean, dare we hope, Mike? Dare we hope? I don't know.
But this goes right back into what I was saying about the scapegoat. It almost has to be innocent, and that's exactly what is always emphasized with Abel. Even up into the New Testament, Abel is looked at as the model of Christ as sacrifice because he was innocent.
Well, and so when you get into the Cain and Abel stuff, there's so much effort put into trying to identify like what was the difference, what was wrong with Cain's sacrifice, and people are trying to identify some mechanic or some technicality or some kind of difference in the sacrifices, right? But from what I've understood, it has very little to do with the nature of the sacrifice as such. You can potentially get interesting ideas from it that could be applicable to the spiritual life, trying to differentiate exactly what the sacrifices were. But at the end of the day, it was about how the sacrifice was offered, in what spirit the sacrifice was offered. And what you get is Cain envying Abel because the way in which he did it pleased the Lord, and Cain's did not. And that's what ends up creating the vengeance. That's what ends up creating the violence. It's this.
And
he's scapegoating him.
You mentioned the relationship between mimetic desire and envy before. And actually, I don't want to go down this trail too far, but if you think of even going back to the garden, it wasn't until it was offered by the serpent that Eve sees the fruit as pleasing to look upon. And so you could almost see another sort of triangular relationship in desire there, where it looks more pleasing because of the temptation. It's precisely because it was desired.
Well, and look how the serpent actually tempts her with it, is he knows that you'll be like God.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to be to imitate, to be like. The desire for transcendence, the desire for theosis, which that actually kind of came up in our last conversation when we were talking about the hero's journey. But again, all of these things, they're ubiquitous in humanity, and so they're going to be ubiquitous in the stories of humanity. Whether we're talking the sacred stories like the pagan myths or the sacred stories of the Jewish and Christian myths in the Old Testament. Let me yes and you there a little bit too. You said desire for transcendence, but I would say the desire for personhood, like the desire to imitate God as person, to be a fully formed human being, because much of the ancient tradition goes into how Adam and Eve were, they were like God and in the image of God, and then they eventually lose the likeness of God through the fall. But, when we talk about that, it's like, well, what were the nature of Adam and Eve prior to the fall? And at least in the East, there's a lot of talk of the childlike innocence. Like, they were not perfected human beings. They were morally just. They were innocent, but they were not mature. They were not their full, fully formed, right? Their final form, let's say.
Yeah.
And so sure. they're trying, and that final form is Christ, right? That final form is to be the exact replica of Jesus, so to speak. So they're trying to actualize that through the shortcut temptation that the serpent's providing them. But it's just another form of trying to imitate a person, and that's Jesus.
Yeah. So there again, and this is all just to emphasize or re-explore the role that mimetic desire has had, again, not just in the quote-unquote fake stories we have, but even in these sacred and real stories that from the Christian tradition we would say are very much a part of just our, not only our history, but our theology, right? Our theology is formed by these things too.
That really kind of brings us around to ideas of atonement, really the heart of what Christ has done for us and what the gospel is and whatnot. So, I mean, what do you probably have some kind of notes on that, right, Mike? So you want to, here you go, bud. So you want to enlighten us about atonement?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, so let's actually kind of take a little bit of a rabbit trail, I guess. It's a divergence, but it's going to definitely help a lot as we go further in our conversation when we start bringing up the actual examples or more examples from the Bible.
Oh, I mean, I think that you should be able to just wrap up atonement in a couple minutes, really.
Yeah,
exactly.
There's
hardly anything to talk about.
It's only 4,000 years worth of theology, right? If we go back to the Old Testament too. So, I mean, yeah, this will definitely be a scratching of the surface, barely a scratch of the surface, a fingernail scratch of the surface. But so really quick, just to define it, I mean, atonement means to reconcile, and a lot of biblical theologians will even use the word at-one-ment is kind of where it comes from. It's making one. These two kind of disproportionate.
No, I remember when I was a young kid. I was in my teens probably, and I was in my evangelical period. And I remember, I'll actually never forget the realization that atonement is just at-one-ment.
Mm-hmm. It's very,
and just how like that blew my mind.
It's very convenient.
Whoa.
It's very convenient when you're
is.
teaching the vocab word to students. When we're talking like
Right.
sacraments or we're talking salvation and stuff. So it's about
Well, and
reconciliation.
let me just
go ahead.
let me just wax on about that a little bit though, because like specifically what blew my mind about it is I was still at a place, and I was like a really young Christian at the time, so I don't think that to be Protestant is to not realize that atonement means at 1 minute or nothing like that. I was just really young. But before that moment though, atonement really just meant, in my mind, this kind of cultural, vaguely pop cultural, superficial idea that like the kind of punishment or the kind of due justice kind of thing.
Well,
like, so like he has been atoned, like the atonement has occurred, and it had all this connotation of the justice has been distributed.
Well, and
or
it's
something
fitting
like
that you said, your understanding of it was very much formed by your Protestantism beforehand, because that is reflective of the atonement theory that's most popular in Protestantism, which we are going to get to like I said, just scratch the surface of the different theories of atonement right after we kind of define it a little bit more thoroughly. But it's not even so much a like for Catholic and Orthodox, it's about unity, and for Protestants, it's not, because they're both about unity. It's just what is the means by which that unity happens, right? And so that's obviously from the more historical Christian, which is Orthodox and Catholic. That's where the sacraments start to come into play, right? And that's why the Catholics and Orthodox can't get rid of the sacraments. It's not like we don't have that power.
It's fundamental.
Yeah.
It's absolutely.
And so it's not
integral. That's a good word for this.
Yeah, to the integrity.
Yeah, to be integrated.
So again, it comes from the Latin word adunamentum, which again does mean unity. So speaks right into what we're talking about. And we've kind of been going through, or we're about to go through, a bunch of these biblical examples, because basically you can't turn a page of the New Testament without having some direct reference, some allusion to atonement, right? Especially, obviously, the atonement of Jesus. But one of the things that we're going to try to kind of highlight as we go through is that there was obviously precedent for this in the Old Testament. That's why there are so many references to Jesus in the New Testament.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And yeah, I know. So this is maybe this is Jacob's turn to maybe shut his brain off or roll his eyes. But there are a couple of catechism paragraphs.
He made me cough. I did that minutes ago.
Yeah. That's
minutes ago.
another opportunity.
Another to persist in the turning off of my brain, for sure.
So the Catechism of the True Church, Catholic Church, Catechism of the Catholic Church, excuse me. It has a few references in the Catechism to atonement. And so in paragraph 623, that's where it talks about the death on the cross. It's Jesus fulfilling his atoning mission. And it does make a reference to Isaiah, to the suffering servant, in regards to this catechism teaching on atonement, which I think is significant, because that's not even the examples that we are going to talk about later. But again, Isaiah is another huge one too.
Well, so if you're talking about and so that suffering servant thing is a big part of the large understanding, especially in the Protestant world, of what atonement is and whatnot. That he's gonna suffer for our sake. He's gonna suffer instead of us.
Yeah, which
and things
we'll
like that.
We'll talk about later. Is penal substitution is what you're.
Yeah, whenever we get around to that, but for the purposes of what we're really getting at right now is atonement at one minute. It's not instead of, it's with, it's within, it's, so all of those verses in the New Testament that some Christians take to mean that he's a substitute for us, are just as easily understood as a participant in with us.
Yeah.
But because of the cultural baggage and because of the kind of preconceptions that are already there in those communities. They just read substitute. They just read in place of and things like that. And I mean, even when the New Testament does use language like that, it's not at the expense of the idea that this is ultimately a unifying force, a participation in thing.
And actually, to your point too, one of the oldest theories, and let's just jump into them. There's a bunch of different theories of atonement. We've already mentioned penal substitution. What you were talking about, and this one goes back to, I don't know if Saint Irenaeus is the first example or not, but I think he's the most well-known example.
He's the first name that comes to mind for me personally.
But we've actually talked about this concept, not in regards to atonement. Do you remember when we were having our conversation on the hero's journey and we mentioned recapitulation? And that's actually...
Who could forget?
Yeah, well, and I think
high point of the series so far, Mike.
And we, this is coming out after Batman, so that's definitely not true. But I know when So if anybody hasn't, but if you guys are listening to this episode, you've probably listened to our Batman one. I remember thinking as we were recording, I was like, this is going to make Jacob want to make this a Batman podcast, because that was definitely like, I was like, oh, wow, Jacob is the most interested he's ever been in. But anyway.
I mean, for one, we weren't recording in the middle of the night, as is Mike's wont. And so let me just, here's a little editor's note for everybody here. Those early episodes are so late at night, and I am not someone who stays awake late anymore. I'm old
man who yells
and
at
those
cloud.
that's me. And I don't stay up late anymore. And so when I listen to those early episodes, it's like, man, I sound so tired.
This is just my...
And you can tell by the second half of those episodes is when I finally kind of started to like wake up and kind of get into the conversation. So if you notice a more verve, a little bit more vitality in my side of that conversation by the second half of those episodes, now you know. It's because that brutal taskmaster Mike was making this old man stay awake late at night past his bedtime.
This is just
in order to try to do these episodes.
One of my many little things that I do to undermine, your presence on the show, so that I can be. I need to be everybody's favorite. So
yeah.
So we've talked about. So again, I mentioned we talked about recapitulation in the context of the hero's journey and of kind of typology. But one of the big areas where it comes up for Irenaeus and in atonement is in the Christus Victor theory of atonement, where it's Christ now becomes, just like Adam was the representative of humanity, and even the name Adam means humanity. So it's almost like you've got the author of the story giving you a little bit of a hint in the name. But he becomes that representative, and he failed. But now Christ becomes the representative of the new humanity, and he succeeds. He's victorious. And so that's where...
But it's fundamentally humanity succeeding.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's the idea of the unity. That's the idea of the at-one-ment and the atonement, is that humanity has failed up to this point, but now humanity is going to succeed where it failed before, because God has entered humanity. And God's going to do for humanity, with humanity, in humanity, by humanity, what humanity is supposed to do.
Well, and this also goes back with, because actually when we were talking about recapitulation during the hero's journey, it led us into our conversation on theosis. And that's the whole idea between, the two natures of Christ being fully God and fully man, but then also being this representative, because then we as humanity experience that theosis, right, taking on the divine nature in participation with the person of Christ. And this all, again, I mentioned sacraments earlier. This is why, we're not gonna spend enough time on this, but like that's why all of these different things. All these
this was supposed to be an aside. It's taken over the podcast.
I know, but
which is fine. But no, it's valuable.
Yeah.
We got to lay some groundwork. I'm sure we'll have a lot more to talk about. But go on. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
And so we've got Christus Victor, which we were saying in one sense it goes back to Irenaeus, but obviously it goes back to St. Paul, because St. Paul refers to Jesus as the new Adam, and so giving him that title is supposed to kind of point you as the reader to this relationship, right? This relationship as
Right.
Adam as representative, Jesus as representative. The other one that, again, we get from ultimately St. Paul, but then we see fleshed out even in a lot of the early fathers, is called the ransom theory of atonement. And this is where you'll actually hear this sort of language used in a lot of like evangelical or Protestant atonement theories or theology as well, where it's like, he paid a debt he did not owe, I owed a debt I could not pay. Did you ever hear that growing up, or do you kind of remember that?
Oh yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah,
and ransom theory. So here's what I'll say. Coming from my Eastern background here, that the Christus Victor is kind of like the primary means that we really engage with atonement theory, so far as I can tell, so far as I'm familiar with. And then the other conversation pieces that float around it, like ransom theory and things like that, these are things that supplement and enlarge and speak to the idea that Christ has, as we say in our Paschal hymn and our Easter hymns, that of course now I'm going to bring as soon as Christ has trampled down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. That's the clarion call. Like that's the gospel. That's what we chant it incessantly during the Easter season. Once we get there, and it's a Christus Victor type, and war cry.
You actually
almost.
Touched on something that I wanted to point out too, which is that at least for these first three, so penal substitution, that would be the one that's sort of the one that has been largely rejected by, again, historical Christianity, just because it's a distortion. But the other three, so the ransom theory, which we just talked about, Christus Victor,
right,
and then this last one called satisfaction, it's not that you pick one at the expense of the other two. It's that they all work together. It's like they're different facets of the same diamond. You know what I mean?
They are, yeah, and they so the ransom theory is where a lot of Protestantism can trace back to some more historical context and be like, oh well, ransom theory, or satisfaction theory, right? In fact, you can almost, again, from my Eastern perspective, you can see the slow, steady walking off the cliff towards penal substitution as you go from Christus Victor to ransom to satisfaction to substitution. But to your point, and I mean, I think that ransom and satisfaction are perfectly acceptable because ransom does capture this idea that Christ is an outsider. He's God. He's outside of creation, and he has to come into a place that's not native to him. He has to be something outside of creation that comes into creation to behave on behalf of creation.
He received a call to adventure.
That's true. Man, you're really bringing all the throwbacks to those episodes.
Oh man, I love it. Yeah, hero's journey. Yeah, keep going. Sorry.
But and so he's a ransom. Like he's being brought in like a ransom, right? And there's a little bit of substitutionary ideas going on in that context. And then the satisfaction thing is the other half of the penal. So if ransom is where you get the substitution, then satisfaction is where you get the penal. Which I think is a distortion. You can totally speak to this, but I think that's why satisfaction becomes penal, because like it's. I'll even let you. I'll quit talking. So, you go ahead and explain satisfaction.
So, well, okay, and yeah, really quick, just to backtrack. So, like you were kind of describing, you do see this sort of, and you wouldn't call it a development, obviously, you'd call it a distortion, like you did, but you sometimes see in some of those Old Testament examples, whether it's, Isaac being substituted for the ram, or you have the Passover lamb, in a sense, substituting for the firstborn when you have Moses in the Passover. That's on the surface what it looks like. Except, just taking the Moses example, if you look at the sacrifice at Sinai, which actually Catholics use in our liturgy for the Feast of Corpus Christi, for the Feast of the Body and Blood of Christ, they read that story, and it's not just that they sacrifice the lamb as a replacement for the people or a substitution. The blood of the lamb gets poured on the altar, but it gets sprinkled on the people. And so there's this unity between you and the sacrifice. It's not that the sacrifice replaces you, it's that you become part of that sacrifice. right? In this, dramatized or symbolic way or whatever.
And I know we're going to get to you're going to go to satisfaction next, but what you just said makes me realize there's something that should get spelt out here, is that no sacrifice is ever about punishing an animal.
Yeah.
Or punishing a criminal or punishing anything. Sacrifice was a meal that was shared. The altar was a table. It was like a culinary table. A sacred, a holy, a divinely, thing. But the animal is killed so that you can eat it. Or in the case of the scapegoat, gets sent away. But even that is so that it can get sent to the demons. What
happens when you consume the animal is you're united with it, or rather, it's united with you, right? And
then also the part that's burnt up is offered to God. So that's God consuming it.
So that's the other part, which, and again, we did talk about this too with the hero's journey, where that's the connection it has to the liturgy, where why do you burn up the rest of the Passover sacrifice? Because then the smoke is rising up to God. It becomes the sacrifice rises up to God. And not only do we see the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, but what happens 40 days after the resurrection, that sacrifice, Jesus is still the Passover lamb, or the new Passover. It rises up to God in the ascension. And so that becomes, that's just as much part of the atonement, or just as much part of the reconciliation, is the rising up. And just to kind of, just to take it one step further, because we already got this momentum. If God was pleased with your sacrifice, God would send fire down from heaven. We see that with Elijah, the prophet Elijah. We see that with the dedication of the temple with Solomon. But do we see God sending fire from heaven after something rises up to God? Jacob, 10 days after the ascension, what happens? God sends the Holy Spirit.
Right? That was a real okay, yeah, I see where you're. Thanks. Yeah. Yes. Let me hit that in the basket here. Yes, the tongues of fire. That's on Pentecost.
Like, that's God showing He's pleased with the sacrifice that rose up in the person of Jesus. It didn't end on Calvary on Friday. It didn't even end, in a sense, on Easter Sunday. Right? This sounds really corny. It's like you'd see this in a Mel Gibson movie, but that was just the beginning, right? I don't want to bring that crowd on me.
You taught me something. You taught me something today, Mike. I had never put two and two together as far as the whole Pentecost thing.
Oh yeah,
it's pretty good.
It's all sacrifice. It's all worship. So
I knew I was keeping you around for something.
Now, where we get this satisfaction, this comes from. I mean, it's the latest one, but as you kind of mentioned, it's a development of the ransom and the Christus Victor. It's a building off of those two, first by Saint Anselm in the 1000s, but then even more so by Saint Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s, and it's this idea of, similar to the recapitulation in Christus Victor, where it's not just Christ representing us in terms of fulfilling the law, but now we participate in the body of Christ, that same body of Christ that died on the cross, that same body of Christ that rose from the dead, that same body of Christ that ascended up into heaven. If we are part of the church, which the Bible calls the church the body of Christ, then we participate in that same body, the body that dies, the body that rises, the body that ascends. And the way that we do that, right, from a historical Christian perspective, well, how are we incorporated into the body of Christ? First, we're baptized into the church. Then how do we continue to unite ourselves? Well, that's through the, what in the West we call the sacrament of communion, right? But Eucharist is just another word for it, which has its other connections and spiritual symbology.
No, but it's great. It's great to use the word communion, especially in the context of this podcast, this episode, because communion. It's communion. And it's funny, back when I was a Protestant, the idea that we would, because, I was raised Lutheran for a long time, and then I went evangelical. So those are my two basic touchstones. And the Lutheran Church still retained a bunch of sacramentality, kind of. I'll give it to you. We're just going to say yes. The Lutherans did.
There is a sense of liturgy that, like, if you were just looking on the surface, you would say, "Oh, it does look similar." Like, you'd even have some, and I mean, I've even had,
and there's
people who
variations
said,
of
"Oh,
Lutheranism.
doesn't it all
things
look
like
the
that
same?"
too,
And it's
but-
like, okay, fine. Well, I'm not gonna agree with you, but I can see why you would say it looks the
yeah,
same.
no. Well, that's,
Yeah,
we'll just give it to them.
Yeah.
And so we would do communion every other week in the church that I was raised in. Every other week we would do communion. But it's maybe I was just a bad catechumen as a Lutheran or something like that. But certainly by the time I was an evangelical, I had not retained from my Lutheranism, and I certainly wasn't experiencing in my evangelicalism what exactly the point was of doing the bread and wine communion outside of just a nice thing to do, a communal act,
like any other,
right? Liturgical,
like any other thing that's
but just a
rejected as
nice
sacrament.
symbol.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a nice symbol, and then once it becomes a nice symbol, it becomes really kind of unessential, and that's exactly what happened. It's exactly what's happened, played out in the churches as such, outside of classical Christian churches, and that's what happened in my own life, and it once you realize what the nature of sacrifices were, just as a paradigm in the Old Testament and the New Testament and within the church, suddenly communion makes so much more sense.
Yeah.
It's not just a symbol. It's how you do things.
Well,
it's how you reconcile to God.
It's not arbitrarily essential.
And it's always been that way. Yeah.
It's not like
Right.
essential because I said so and I have all the power. It's intrinsically essential in that part of the
It's intrinsic,
like
yeah.
part of the nature of the thing itself, right?
Yeah.
In the same way that part of the nature of communion requires sacrifice in some way too. And this kind of, I mean, I guess if it sort of brings it full circle, like this whole conversation is about the scapegoat. And what was it that when the people determined who the scapegoat was, or when they all turned on the scapegoat and they finally banished the scapegoat, what did it do in the community? What did they achieve? They achieved atonement. They achieved unity amongst themselves. It stopped the fighting because they could all gang up on this one, whatever they determined the problem was. And so now we can, of course, argue and recognize that this was a false unity or a false atonement, but that's why the scapegoat mechanism developed.
Yeah, and in fairness to the Old Testament and things like that, I think what you were describing is like this kind of worldly sense of scapegoat, but the scapegoat and where we get the word scapegoat in the Old Testament, we're not necessarily denigrating that.
Well,
that God ordains practice, that has a significance for the people of Israel.
Well, no, because
and for the people who.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, are you disagreeing with me, or
No,
are you agree?
This is it. No, what you're describing is exactly what Girard noticed, and we're going to get into this more. Is that it's in the Old Testament and then the New Testament, where to every other ancient culture, the scapegoat was actually the problem, whereas in the Old Testament, it's God, through the stories of the Old Testament, saying, no, the scapegoat was actually the innocent one. Like it was we were the problem by always blaming it. So that's where, it kind of inverts or subverts that mechanism. So no, you're right. This is not us endorsing. This is us saying, this is how we operate. And the whole point of why it's included in the Old Testament and then ultimately the New Testament with Jesus is that it's flipping it on its head.
Yeah, well, and I
keep
also
steamrolling you because I'm excited.
No, you're not steamrolling. It's just that you just keep saying something just slightly that just like, I don't know if I'd phrase it like that. And that's to say, because the scapegoat, there was a scapegoat in the Old Testament, in the Mosaic Law, as given by God. It's just that scapegoat, he wasn't there just to be punished. Eventually, and, I'll throw out, I learned some of this from Lord of Spirits podcast. I love that podcast. Good job, folks. But, the scapegoat is sent out in the wilderness to remove the sin from Israel, but it's not inherently, it's not to punish the scapegoat initially. It's just to remove it from the community, right? And put it back out amongst where the demons live, out in the wilderness. The demonic realities go to live with the demons and things like that. Now, evidently later on, the nation of Israel did develop the practice of like driving it off a cliff or stoning it and killing it so that it wouldn't wander back into the community and bring the sins back with it. But even then, it's never necessarily just because we need to punish something for the sake of punishing evil. It's more about just removing it from the community kind of thing.
Better that thing than us. Yeah.
Yeah, the distortion is that it's punishment or something like that.
So we kind of talked about Abel. I mean, I think we could certainly talk more about Abel. Like when we talk about him, the language that's used, even in the Cain and Abel story, I'm not even looking ahead to the book of Hebrews yet, where Abel is certainly talked about as a sacrifice. But when God says to Cain, his blood is crying out to me, that's exactly the role that the sacrificial animal would have in the temple, in terms of it becomes the prayer that goes up to God or speaks up to God. And so when God says that to Cain, that it's Abel that's doing it, he's putting Abel in that role of sacrifice. So, you were talking before about the conversation that people have, they get so hung up on, what was the sacrifice that was offered? Why wasn't it? Why was it? And I'm saying it's not about the real sacrifice that Abel offered ultimately was himself. Gosh, I wonder if that has resonance in the Christian tradition too. That's really the kind of the big takeaway, right? That it becomes.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. And in fact, I've never actually heard that before, but that makes sense to me. Huh. Certainly the idea of him being a kind of image of Christ's sacrifice, I think that I might have heard that before, but not exactly the way that you phrased it. So that's pretty good.
Well, yeah, the him being the almost like a shadow or a type for the sacrifice of Jesus. That's from Hebrew, or the letter to the Hebrews. But then the language that's being used, I mean, and if you kind of go along the lines of like the first 5 books of the Bible, even if we want to say that they were, inspired by Moses or sort of like written by Moses, they still would have been through the lens of the temple priests, as they were actually putting them down on paper in the actual temple. You know what I mean? And so the temple priests in the during the time of Solomon or after Solomon, they would have been using that language, almost like putting it back into the story. And again, not to undermine the reality of the story. If anything, it's looking at the historical event through sacred eyes, through the lens of God, right? And that's the inspiration of the scriptures.
No, and the idea that these, kind of patterns of reality are manifestations of the deepest pattern of reality, which is Christ himself, right? The logos of reality. And that logos is very much in this kind of communal sacrificial mode. It's not the world we live in nowadays, right? The world we live in nowadays is hyper not communal. For all of its social media facade, it's, especially post-COVID, we're more atomized than ever.
But there again, that shows the need for we talked about the modern versions of scapegoating. It's because we're grasping at that community, and we're doing it in these sort of like indirect, or you could say disordered ways, right? We have to do it because we have to get back to that sense of true communion, which the scapegoat can temporarily provide.
Well, and when you're talking about kind of like culture war politics, everyone's always jonesing for the blood, so to speak, quote unquote, of the enemy, right? And it's a unifying force for your own side. Everyone unifies around the destruction, the social, the reputational destruction of, the other guy. And people love to get together to hate something, or to put their animosity upon something. It really gets us going.
So I think another Old Testament example that I really want us to get to, and I'm almost thinking we're going to have to do a part 3, because I have 2 more Old Testament ones, and then we got to talk about Jesus, right? How do we refer to Jesus in this episode again? As the
scapegoat.
Yeah, there you go.
Is that
exactly.
what you want?
Yep, that's what I was looking for.
Okay.
So we have we talked about Abel, and we talked about how this mimetic desire between Abel and his brother, not only do we see how it parallels, the pagan Romulus and Remus founding of Rome story, but we see how it was conditioned it conditioned Cain, and then it led to the crisis, which led to the violence. But now we have another sort of like an example of somebody taking on the sins of the community, or in this case, the representative of the community, and that person has to be sent away, has to be sent out. And that's exactly what we see in the Abraham, Ishmael, and Isaac story. So usually when we think of the Abraham story and we think of the sacrifice, who do we think of?
Isaac.
We think of Isaac, right? We think of Isaac as he's the one that they went up the mountain. He was the one that was offered on the altar, offered up to God. And then, there was the ram that was sort of put in place and all that sort of stuff. And we're not going to get into atonement theories and all that right now. But what I would argue is that there was a sacrifice, so to speak, or a scapegoat, so to speak, and it was based off of mimetic desire, which led to a mimetic crisis, and that was this desire for the heir, right? That was conditioned through, in one sense, going against God's plan, conditioned through Hagar, which led to Ishmael. And what does it lead to? Because remember, in mimetic desire, there's the internal and the external. And the external we don't worry about because those people are in a different world. They're not seen as competitors to us. But when you're living in the same community, the same tribe, and in the same tent, so to speak, that person who has the thing or produces the thing that you were supposed to do, that's going to lead to competition. That's going to lead to a crisis. And so we see Sarah and Hagar, this mimetic crisis that builds up. And what does it then lead to? Or what has to happen in order for there to be peace in the community?
They got to drive Hagar and Ishmael out.
They have to
send
have
them into the wilderness. Right?
And that's what, and what is the reason for the sending away of Hagar and Ishmael? It's because Abraham didn't follow through the way that God had told him to.
Rather, he kind of tried to jumpstart it by his own volition, which sounds an awful lot like what we just described Adam and Eve doing with the serpent, where it's still taking place within this kind of mimetic construct, but it's them trying to shortcut or achieve what they think God wants them to do on their own, kind of methods. It's a type of that as well.
And I'm using a lot of this sort of language on purpose, the way of like, it had to be driven out. It had to take on, it had to be almost representative of the sins of the leader or the sins of the people, because so now we see this again told in Abraham. We've already seen it told in Abel. And I was telling you before how the first 5 books of the scriptures, they were written by Moses, or they were, orally told by Moses to the scribe, or however you want to say it, but they still would have been put down officially, right, or codified by those temple priests. And so they're using temple language. Well, what do we see in the book of Leviticus? Is we see this ritualized, because in Leviticus 16, what is told to us in that chapter but the ceremony, the ritual of the scapegoat, where the scapegoat is actually brought to the temple, and the priest will lay his hands upon it, and it will be driven out of the community because it's carrying the sins. The priest puts his hands over, which represent the transferring of the sins of the people onto that goat, and then it's driven out into the desert. Well, doesn't that sound exactly? You have the leader of the community, the spiritual leader of the community, putting the sins of the people onto that thing and then driving it into the wilderness. Doesn't that sound exactly what Abraham did to Hagar and Ishmael? So the scapegoat, not only did the Israelites have a Passover lamb, which sort of represents, Isaac being spared on Mount Moriah, but they also had a scapegoat modeled after Ishmael. Both of Abraham's sons became sacrifices, ritualized sacrifices to the Old Testament people.
I just want to say, I'm glad that you've read Leviticus, because heaven knows I've never read that book. So, at least we have you here. That's why I keep you around, Mike.
Yeah, that's a big admission to the, no.
Oh, I don't know. I'm sure I've read it once or sometime, maybe, who knows? It's the idea of the scapegoat being driven out in the wilderness and kind of taking on that kind of symbolism of the sins being removed from the people. That's where, the goat in Scape-GOAT comes from this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's also
even though the
interesting.
title comes from it, as we've already shown, the concept is, that's prehistorical. But sorry, go ahead.
Oh, nothing. I was just going to say that it's interesting that we gravitate towards this kind of like goat imagery, and then ultimately that kind of transforms into like goat-headed Satan stuff.
Well,
really, it was more of a tangent, but
and then obviously, you have the whole Matthew 25 image of the sheep and the goats, right? And so you kind of get that sense too of like the sheep are brought in, which again, if you want to talk about that in terms of temple sacrificial imagery, I mean, when they burned the Passover sacrifice, the remains would be burnt and it would rise up to God through the smoke. And so there's a sense of it being united to God, just like the sheep in Matthew 25 are united. And what happens to the goats? They are sent away, right? And so there again, it's the same sort of idea.
That idea, the sacrifice itself is communion, right? The sacrifice itself, the one that's actually offered to God, is the sharing of a meal with God, right? And so the smoke that arises becomes how God participates in the meal that we're sharing, because those priests would go on and some of the meat they would eat and some of it they wouldn't, and things like that. But like basically the idea behind any pagan sacrifice or any sacrifice from ancient periods of time was that you were entering into a meal with the deity that you were sacrificing to. And that's still ultimately true for the Israelites. And it's ultimately
true
on
Sinai in Exodus on Sinai.
Ultimately true for us as Christians when we partake in the Eucharist and whatnot. We're entering into communion with the deity by the meal that we're participating in. My point being that what gets driven off is not a part of that meal. It's not a part of that communion. It is the opposite of the unity that you are seeking with the participants of the meal that you are partaking of. It is rejected and not in the community. The opposite of community.
Well, and the idea of it, and I want to kind of circle back a little bit to the not only the Leviticus 16, but then the Abraham, Ishmael, and Isaac thing. That sense of rejection ties in perfectly, and it actually will feed into our final segment. The big reveal, why is Jesus the scapegoat, is because he fulfills not only the Passover sacrifice or the Isaac sacrifice on the mountain, right? When God stops Abraham from sacrificing Isaac and he says, God will provide the sacrifice. But he fulfills the Ishmael, the scapegoat. Jesus, just as much as he is Isaac, the fulfillment of Isaac, he's actually the fulfillment of Ishmael. And think of how powerful and important that he is going to fulfill both roles. He's not just the rejected one, like you were saying, he's not just the accepted one, he's the rejected one too. He fulfills not just the one covenant, but he fulfills all covenants, right? Or he fulfills all the relationships, even the broken one, even the one that represents taking on, just like Ishmael had to do, right? Ishmael did nothing wrong, but he took on, or he suffered the sins of, the community, or the sins of the father. And the goat did nothing wrong, and yet the priest puts his hands over it. It represents the sins of the people, and it goes off into the wilderness.
Yeah, and that's true. There's more that can be said when it comes to what exactly is happening with that scapegoat, but I don't necessarily want to derail where you're going with this. Okay, my bad. Where were you going to go with this?
So what do we see with Jesus is not only is he the one who becomes the sacrifice, and this actually goes back into when a lot of Christians were trying to evangelize and convince a lot of the early Jewish people about Jesus being the Messiah, is they use this kind of sacrificial language. And one of the biggest objections was, sacrifices, they have to happen in the temple. And that's why we see, even in the Gospels themselves, this is like during the biblical period, this is how early it is, why John makes such a big deal about Jesus referring to the temple of his body. It's not just, yes, of course, it's a prophecy of the resurrection, but it's also referring to its sacrificial language. And, there's this whole thing about how there would be this river coming from the side of the temple, and during the Passover they would be sacrificing all these lambs, and so there would be blood and water flowing from the side of the temple. And so that's why John makes a point of including that when the blood and water flow from the side of Christ on the cross in John 19. But
interesting.
But again, why that was so significant is because we still participate in the one sacrifice, and the sacrifice is taking place in the temple. Now, obviously, the Jewish temple was destroyed by the Romans. It's the temple of Jesus's body, and it's still taking place there because what is present at every divine liturgy, at every Mass? The body of Christ. Sure. And so that's where the worship, that's where the sacrifice is taking place. But so that was the one side of it. But then the other side is there was that, again, going back to Abraham and Isaac, and then the scapegoat in Leviticus, I think it's 16, that's the one that takes on, representing, taking on the sins of the people, and it's sent out of the town. What happens with Jesus at the trial?
Well, he gets condemned by the people and sent, rejected, right?
Well,
is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, and in classic Catholic spirituality, the image for the sins of the people is the cross itself. And so, what does he carry outside of the town? He's carrying those sins, and it was placed on his shoulders, right? And so,
right. Oh, and so much of this is what's considered scandalous, right? As St. Paul describes it, the idea that this messianic figure would be a scapegoat. There's been a ton of ink spilled on this topic. It's just, it didn't compute, and it still doesn't compute for us because we don't consider these scapegoat characters to be admirable or the people that we want to identify with.
See,
want to imitate.
We're still operating, again, just to kind of tying this back to Girard. Girard saw the scapegoat mechanism obviously preceding Christianity, and he saw it independently of Judaism, even though we see that image in, like I said, the Old Testament. The difference was that Judaism first in the Old Testament and Christianity, it turns the scapegoat on its head in saying not only is the scapegoat innocent, but it's the scapegoat that becomes the savior. And the big example is Joseph and the sons of Israel, because he's the scapegoat in that family, right? The brothers take all their resentment and frustration, and they were going to kill him. And so again, it would have definitely followed this pattern. But what do? They send him away from the community. Now, they do kind of band together from this. It does cause that temporary unity that the scapegoat is supposed to cause. But how does the story turn it on its head? They aren't saved from it, right? They are still subject to the famine. They're still subject to death. It's only when that scapegoat is empowered or returns in power, so to speak, that's where the real salvation comes. And gosh, I wonder if there's something, if only there was some sort of comparison of the scapegoats. It seems to unite the people, right? Don't the people seem united at the trial? When they all shout the same thing,
absolutely.
They're all united around.
Well, does it not say they shouted with one voice?
So so there's this pseudo unity that's created, and yet that's not the real power of the scapegoat, right? It's in the return, and then again from a Christian standpoint, the resurrection. It's the scapegoat who's seen as the real savior, not just as this mechanism that now we all have something to unite us. Yeah, exactly.
It's this kind of superficial and sinful version of, and by sinful, in this kind of classical sense, we mean kind of aberration of, or incomplete form of, or misconstrued version of what is actually valued, what actually is the divine, template, so to speak.
And obviously the real temptation about it is that initially it does work, and we've been trying that, our generations have been trying that, and it's been seeming to work, in a very limited or, like you said, superficial sense every time.
Well, yeah. So if what's binding you is hatred of something else instead of love of something that's bringing you together, right? that's very likely not going to last, right? I think about this sometimes. I'm kind of a big history guy, and I wonder about the ebb and flow of the church throughout church history. In a lot of ways, it's been a lot of constant expansion, right? And lots of success, obviously. And yet, at the same time, it's like when you read the Gospels, there's this anticipation of like, imminent victory. And imminent can mean a lot of things when you're talking about God, right? But when I look at the world today, and it feels like there's a lot of kind of satanic forces at work that are making kind of strides into classically Christian areas of the world, or kind of secular philosophy is infiltrating so much of the Christian church, regardless of what denomination you are, where it's no longer the Spirit of God that's kind of motivating people's ideas, but instead it's this kind of world zeitgeist. Because modernity is absolutely this kind of a zeitgeist, and it permeates everything, and that means the church too. And it's like, why does this victory, at least in my generation, right? I can only speak through my eyes as someone who lives right here in 2023. Why does this victory not look very victorious, right?
And there again, it didn't, from the, whether you were at the top of the cross or the bottom of the cross, it didn't look victorious either. And yet.
No. And so I have absolute faith that the victory is real and the victory is eternal, right? And that it's ever present. I guess what I'm getting at when it's related to this kind of mimetic conversation, and the scapegoat type concept, is the victory of Christ is not going to be defined by the outward appearance of like what is holding people together at any given moment. But it's going to be found because what's holding people together at any given moment in our sinful fallen state is usually hating something, right? And that's just not what the church is, but the church persists in the love of the church. And not to get all invisible, church Protestant or whatever, because that's not at all what I'm saying. I believe that the physical reality of the church and its people and its buildings and its kind of Christendom, things like that, is what the church means. But the victory is always being filtered through this kind of like fallen situation, and that's a scapegoaty type thing.
Yeah, well, and there again, it's you do kind of have to take those lenses that only see, winning from God's point of view as we have the most representatives in Congress, or we have the most laws that support us, or the most this and that, or the most successful company is run by a Christian. It's like you have to break away from all those, because you're seeing God purely in terms of power, and that's actually what paganism had done throughout all of human history. Like that's the it's only the God's power being made perfect in weakness from the 2 Corinthians line, or physically manifested on the cross, or physically manifested in the person of Joseph in the Old Testament, or countless examples, right? Abel is the in a sense the one who was closer with God, even though no other community would have made that story,
right? And
so obviously you can see how morally how this applies in countless applications, and that's kind of the whole point. I know maybe it sounds like I've been coming back to this over and over, but that's the beauty of Rene Girard's mimetic desire, mimetic crisis, and the scapegoat. All of those things wrapped together. The whole mimetic theory is that it is ubiquitous. It you can't not see it everywhere once you once you see it. And he saw it in fiction and mythology primarily, but that's the beauty of fiction and mythology, is that they're a reflection of us. And so, once the scales fall from your eyes and you see it there, you start to see it everywhere, and it should affect your own personal way of viewing, whether it's your own faith or, like you said, the church in general or the church out in the world.
And it's funny. I'm actually listening to some like Audible great course stuff about pagan sacrifice and things like that. Just kind of been casually listening through it. And a lot of academia will discuss these types of concepts as in we make up these kind of theological justifications for human behavior, and sacrifice as such, as a system, in that light would have been something that like, oh, well, we see the scapegoat play out in our kind of intersocial lives, so we got to that's where sacrifice comes from, right? But because we believe that Jesus is the lamb slain from the foundation of the world, what we're picking up on is not as arbitrary as what your typical academic, and I suppose Girard, he probably was approaching it from that kind of level of arbitrariness initially, maybe, but then I think as he evolved through his life, he began to understand this in much more of a kind of transcendent way. Is that accurate?
It's kind of a chicken and egg thing. So in one sense, it comes up naturally as part of our, and you could say part of our fallen nature, right? It's that's how the social structures will be built or whatever. That's what's going to naturally flow from it. But then again, you almost have to ask like, well, then do we come up with the rules that surround it? Or are they both kind of they're complementary, like they play together. And so I'm actually going to talk about this in the minisode when we talk about scapegoat and atonement. Is you see it played out in practice in the Genesis story, but then you actually see it codified in Leviticus. And so I wonder if it's kind of similar when it comes to like human communities or human nature, where we'll start to do this practice, and then we'll create stories around it, we'll create laws around it. And that seems to kind of be the more natural way, right? Just in terms of, we started doing before we started writing about what we were doing, of course. And so it's kind of the same idea. But what you're kind of arguing is that we do it because there's something, and like you were saying, we fall in, every human community falls into the scapegoat mechanism because it preceded humanity. Right. And so,
well, and it's every human community, right? Like human society as such, any historical record we have is playing with these themes. And so far as we can tell, it's never not been present to the human psyche. There's another,
go on. There's another, and I've actually, you and I have talked about this book, the Christ Connection by he was a sociologist, or I think he's still alive, but Roy Abraham Varghese, who did exactly what you were saying. He went into all these pre-Christian or would have had no contact with either Christianity or Judaism, and you start to see all these similarities. And it's not because, or maybe it was, there's like this one example that everybody copied from, or you could say there was this one, human community that we all sort of flow from, and that same human nature was put into us or implanted into us. And part of that includes a sense for God, a sense that we fall short in that relationship, and so we need to give up something to atone for that, right?
Well, that's all well and good, Mike. I'm just getting hungry, so
yeah, exactly.
I mean, like, I'm ready to eat.
Yeah.
So are you done? Can we move on?
I guess so. Yeah. Until next time. Well, you know what? Thanks for putting up with me, Jacob.
No, I need to read more Girard. Yeah.
Definitely. No, that's always true. But so thank you guys for coming to listen. If you guys want to keep hearing more of this, like, subscribe, leave a 5-star rating. Right, Jacob?
That's right. 5 stars all day, every day.
Yeah, we can't wait to do this again, and have a good day.
Scapegoat.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.